Hello, hello. How's everyone doing today? How's it going, William?
Pretty good. How's it going, Angel? How are you?
Doing great. All right. Think we got a good chunk of folks joining in as we speak. So welcome everyone. This is a Learn Live session on how to publish libraries of reusable infrastructure code using template specs. So before we dive into all this terminology, real quick, my name is Angel Perez. I'm a program manager on the Azure Deployments product team. I'll hand it over to Will.
And hello, everyone. Hope everyone's excited here to learn about Bicep and template specs with ARM templates. My name is William Salazar. I'm a senior customer engineer on the Azure FastTrack team.
Awesome. Without further ado, say hi to our moderator, Will. He's going to be helping facilitate this session today. All right, let's dive right in. So you folks can follow along with us. Feel free to go to ak.ms/learnlive-2022-06-28A. You can also scan that QR code there. It'll get you to that a little bit faster. But before diving in, I guess I want to quickly talk about what our learning objectives are going to be today. So we mentioned the word template specs a couple times already, but first off, what is a template spec? To kind of get that question out of the way real quick, think of a template spec as a container for an ARM template. So if you've used an ARM template or a Bicep template before, any kind of infrastructure as code, you can package that template itself and have it live in this Azure resource called the template spec. We'll dive a little bit more later on what we can do with that. But now that we have that out of the way, so we're going to be learning about how to create and deploy these template specs, as well as version these template specs. And why is that important? So the why has to do a lot of the sharing problem. So today you might have, William, we might have 100 plus templates for all of our different app teams. Let's suppose we run a company together. I know the example on the Learn Path itself is a toy company. But to keep it interesting, let's say we own an e-commerce company. How about that? Does that sound good, William?
Yeah, that sounds exciting.
All right. So we're trying to help anyone and everyone with all things e-commerce. And we have a bunch of app teams, we have research teams, what have you. Right now, Will and myself are the only ones that have the cloud know-how on how to configure these resources, which resources should be together in the same template, as well as a bunch of other security scenarios that are very important, like not leaving open ports on VMs or storage accounts, etc. So today, Will and I are kind of the bottleneck for our e-commerce company, because every time an app team needs something, they end up having just to get in line and ask me or Will, hey, can you please provision this virtual machine for me? And doing it the right way. By the right way, what we mean is with Will and I's company policies. So maybe there is some security policies that are very required in the way we create Azure resources. Maybe there's some kind of nomenclature that we want our app teams to use, because we want to be able to easily identify them in our Azure subscription. Whatever it is, these list of things end up embodying the company policies that the company I created with Will just 5 minutes ago has to kind of enforce on the way these Azure resources are created by our app teams. So the problem in essence is sharing. How do we create best practice stuff, best practice Azure resources, and easily share it across however many app teams we have in however many environments? We're going to see how we can do that with template specs today.
Yep. So the goal is we want to make everyone to be able to self-provision their Azure environments with as minimal intervention from any centralized governing department or team, but at the same time making sure that everyone's adhering to the same security and standards that the company has set up.
Correct, because it's a double-edged sword. If you give too much flexibility, then maybe teams are creating stuff the wrong way with the wrong SKUs that end up incurring more costs, or with the unspecified IP addresses creating another security issue. So with template specs, we're gonna see how you get the best of both worlds in terms of allowing that flexibility, but also ensuring that the right security guidelines and company policies that you want to impose are followed. All right. So we already talked how template specs is kind of a container for an ARM template. So Will, have you deployed an ARM template before?
Yes, many times.
And have you deployed a bicep template as well?
Yes. So the difference is, there's no, I would say, there's no one-to-one correspondence between an ARM template and a bicep template, right? You can use bicep to generate ARM templates, but a bicep template is more of a modular language. Would you agree, Angel?
Yep.
That's kind of the comparison there.
And what you said is very key. So a bicep file compiles down to an ARM template at the end of the day. And that ARM template is what gets stored in a template spec. So today, if you take a bicep file and create a template spec with that, what's going to be happening behind the scenes is an ARM template's being created and stored into that template spec resource. Um, so, all right, we got our example scenario out of the way. Will and Angel's e-commerce company. That's where we're at. And right now we're responsible for deploying all of the infra, and it's basically all of we do. That takes up all of our time. So we can't focus on what's the V next investments for our company. So right now, we're going to try and figure out how to tackle this sharing problem and how we're going to do that with template specs. So in this module, we're going to learn about template specs in the sense of, sorry, I think I went a slide too far. There we go. We're going to learn about how you first take whatever template file or bicep template file and package that into a template spec. And after that, William, what are some of the things you think we can do with that template spec once it's already packaged and up in our Azure resource group?
So some of the things that we can do with that template spec is deploy it, right? We can start using that to make it a reusable asset inside our Azure subscription, right? So once we described it, once we built it, and again, we're doing all the building of these templates in Bicep, which is a nice twist, right? The end result of that is going to be that template spec, as Angel said, and then we'll be using that inside the Azure portal to make it consumable by everyone.
Awesome. All right, so by the end of this module, you'll be able to create the template spec, publish it, and by publish, you're going to notice that we mean after that original V1 template spec got created, what happens if you have to change something, but you want to keep that same template spec resource ID? What happens in that case is you publish a new version to that same template spec. We'll get to see that in a little bit more detail. So besides publishing, as William mentioned, we can deploy these. So anyone in the portal can click on that template spec in particular and deploy it to whatever scope they want to. That is allowed. And then furthermore, how do we manage these template specs? There are a resource itself in Azure, so we can manage them as we would any other resource. All right, so before switching over to some more demo stuff, let's understand template specs a little bit more theoretically. So we mentioned how before, if we've deployed an ARM template, we're all pretty much halfway there in our understanding. The only new thing with template specs is, again, that ARM template is being packaged into a resource in Azure called template specs. And what it makes, it basically gives the ability for that ARM template to be referenced and deployed. And by reference, we mean someone else in their own ARM template can also reference this template spec. Even more so in bicep modules, for those of you who've played with bicep modules before, you can also reference the template specs as part of a module. We'll
So
get
the
to
nice,
see that.
so the nice thing about kind of the deployment of these Azure Resource Manager templates is you could do it either with Bicep or with JSON. Personally, I find Bicep a little bit more intuitive. That's kind of what we'll be using throughout the demos today. But there's really nothing that prevents you from doing it with JSON as well. And we'll cover some of that if anybody has any questions along those lines.
Yep. All right. So for our e-commerce company, why should we be using template specs? So I guess let's see, what kind of resources do you think our app teams might need, William? Maybe
So
some web apps.
yeah, some storage accounts, some virtual networks. Um, there's various different things that you would need to maybe launch a website, or an Azure service plan would be other examples of some resources that would be reusable.
Got it. And right now, these resources, an app team could probably go and try and create those, provision those infrastructures themselves. But it's very likely there will be some mistakes involved, whether it's mistakes on the naming or what SKU is being used for a particular VM. Whatever that may be, we're going to avoid that error from ever happening because right now, William and I, we're going to work on some templates. So we're going to, in Bicep, author some templates with the intention of pre-packaging them into a template spec. And the intention behind this is very important because essentially what you end up doing is creating a self-service model for your app teams. You want your app teams to be able to go whatever moment in their project and say, oh, okay, so I need to create two VMs and two SQL databases and a Cosmos storage account so I can move on with this part of my project. Let me just pick exactly those templates in my template spec list, create those, and I'm moving on. If we don't do this work right now of intentionally picking what part of infrastructure we want them to self-serve, then we might still be in the business of every time an app team wants to do something, they have to come back to us. And then we have to actually review everything, make sure that it abides by the company guidelines.
Exactly. And if you're following DevOps best practices, kind of your level of maturity in your organization kind of goes up a notch once you're able to do exactly what Angel said, which is allow that self-service and ability for your developers or any other end users to do that in their environments. You just reached that additional level of DevOps maturity.
Correct. All right. So we did the work. We already did all this work. So we already created all these templates for our e-commerce business that is yet to be named. But before moving on to the demo again, I mentioned how a template spec can be referenced as a bicep module. And for those of you who don't know what modules are, we're just going to take a brief moment to kind of differentiate the two and talk a little bit about modules. How would you explain bicep modules in your own words, William?
So to me, a bicep module, you could probably best describe it as a reusable snippet of code that you can reuse throughout your entire set of bicep files, rather than having that exact same lines of code appear in different bicep files. You'll create one module and just reuse it from wherever you need to use it using parameters.
Yep, that's exactly right. So you can think of a bicep module as sets of code that you want to just not have to write again, and you can reference this specific module at the beginning of a bicep file, and it copies over all of that essentially. So it's meant to be used that way, and the key distinction is that bicep modules live in somewhere you control. So for example, source control, that would be one place, whereas template specs live in Azure. So in your Azure subscription, in some resource group or other scope, you have these template specs living there. So that's one thing to note. And also template specs are kind of intended to be deployed. So whatever ARM template bicep you store into that template spec, it's probably going to be an atomic unit that can be later on deployed, not necessarily used as you would use a module. So again, a module is meant to be imported as a library into another file, whereas a template spec is more click to deploy here. That being said, you can use a template spec to and reference it in a bicep module and kind of bring that back in there. Another thing to note is that bicep modules retain all of the bicep syntax and how it's written, whereas a bicep template that gets added to a template spec, it's converted to that ARM template JSON. But again, if it's intended to just be deployed and not messed with at all, it doesn't really matter for enabling that self-service model of having your app teams just quickly remove that time to deploy bottleneck. Um, Anything else that comes to mind, William? Did I
No,
cover?
I think you gave it a good summary, Angel. You know, basically, Bicep, you can use that, think of that as the language that you'll be using to author your template specs. And the end result is the template specs that's pretty much JSON or ARM templates that are stored as resources in Azure.
And for those of you who don't know what ARM is, probably said the word a couple times already. It stands for Azure Resource Manager, and it's the infrastructure as code language that Bicep is built on top of. So
Correct. In fact, all of the Azure REST APIs are built on top of that.
awesome. All right. So to kind of ease into this demo, some visual aspect. I always love diagrams to help understand things better. So a template spec, again, you can think of it as a container for an ARM template, a bicep template. So right now you could see this would potentially live at something like a resource group scope, and the template spec itself would have an ARM template in it that can be deployed. So after this template spec becomes published, maybe it got deployed to various environments, and you notice, hey, there's another VM SKU that actually has to be used by app teams. Let's publish a different version to that template spec. So when the next time an app team has to redeploy this, they're gonna adopt those changes that are, I guess, evolving as an environment evolves. And this happens every day as you mature in your cloud journey. You're always staying tuned to what are the latest resources, what are the latest updates, how can I continue to adapt to the way the industry is heading. And in those moments, you essentially have to decide for the set of templates that I enabled in this self-serve vending machine of templates for my app teams, which of those need to receive incremental updates as things continue to improve, or maybe a security uh, bug was recently patched. So in the act of doing that, we're publishing a new version, or maybe overwriting an existing version. So template specs versions contain that actual template copy, whereas the template spec is the container resource that contains all the different versions you might have created. All right, but without further ado, let's just dive right into this demo. Handing it over to you, William.
Sure. So here we're going to go ahead and show you how we would create and publish a template spec. So with that, we're going to say, and hopefully everybody can see my screen here.
Yep, we can see it.
Yep, perfect. Thank you. So at Ankel's and my toy company, right? Our team's been working with Azure for a while. We've created a lot of templates that we use on a regular basis. So we want to take one of those templates and actually make it a template spec. And we're going to start with one that we're going to use to create what we call Cosmos DB accounts, right? And so if you're looking here, I start with like I would, and for those of you who are new to Bicep, we start with what we call a main.bicep file. As you can tell, I have this open up in Visual Studio Code. And then pretty much the way you declare a traditional bicep file or a standard bicep file is by specifying parameters up top, and then followed by specifying exact resource that you want to create. For each parameter, we can give it a description. So in the case of our sample here that we're going to use to create a template spec, I've got two parameters here. I've got one for location and one for the name of the Cosmos DB account. They're both going to be strings. So for my location, I'm pretty much just grabbing whatever resource group, the location of the resource group that I'm going to be deploying to. And for my Cosmos DB account name, I can give it a couple other identifiers in Bicep. One would be the description. What does this parameter do? And this says this parameter is going to be the name of the Cosmos DB account. This name must be globally unique, right? And it must only include lowercase letters, numbers, and hyphens. So it kind of tells me what the limitations are. It has to be at least 3 characters in length with a maximum of 44. So kind of I set my default name here by appending the name toy with a unique string derived from the resource group ID. So those are my 2 parameters. The next thing I'm going to do here in this bicep file is declare the resource. And this resource is going to be a document DB or a Cosmos database account. So in this case, I'd use the Microsoft document DB resource ID for a database account, and I pass it the version for this API, right? Again, every time you declare a resource in either ARM or in Bicep, that resource ID is a combination of the various different IDs to declare that resource, followed by the version of the REST API they're going to be using. The resource takes a couple of additional parameters. It's going to require a name, a kind, in this case, the kind or the type for this resource is going to be a global document DB, and then takes a location, followed by several different properties. One would be a consistency policy, and in this case, I'm going to say the default consistency level is going to be the session, which means it's going to be the duration of this, excuse me, would be for a session. Followed by a property of locations, and the location is going to tell me the location name for this account, the failover priority, which will be 0, and if it's zone redundant. Lastly, I'm going to pass in the database account offer type, which is standard. So that's will be the SKU for the type of account we're going to create. Whether we're going to enable automatic failover or enable multiple write locations. For those, I'll turn both false. And the backup policy, we're going to say it's going to be of type continuous. So these are all parameters that you pass in when you're creating a Cosmos database account. I'll pause here to let anybody pass any questions in the chat window that our moderator can answer. So basically, that's. Angel, did we have anything going there?
No, I was just going to
Okay.
ask very quickly. So
Sure.
this would be the first template, if you will, if anyone wants to create a Cosmos DB account in our app teams.
Correct.
But they don't have to, I guess, dive in this deep into actually opening up the template code. When it's in a template spec, they're going to be able to just reference it and deploy it.
Exactly. So this is so we're covering this because we're actually creating the template spec. But you're right. Once the template spec is created, the end users, all they would need to know is what type of parameters that template spec requires.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of doing this, right? This is only something that, for example, in this case, if Angel and I are the authors of the template spec, we need to know that. We need to be very have intimate knowledge of the different Azure resources that we're creating, so that we know how we want them created. All the end user needs to know is what unique parameters they're going to pass in to create the resource in Azure according to the standards that Angel and I set up.
So we can require specific parameters, like let's say, for example,
this one.
A team name has a particular cost center or something.
Correct.
require that so every time the template spec gets deployed, it's required of them to pass that in?
Yes. So for example, here I could say, no matter who creates a Cosmos database account, I want the backup policy to be continuous, which means it's going to do backups on a continuous basis rather than periodical. I don't want anybody doing periodical. So in that case, I've made that in here.
Got it.
So when someone creates that, by default, they're going to have a backup policy of type continuous. So that's an example of standards that you can set inside the template spec.
Awesome.
So very good question. So one of the important things to consider when you're using your template, and this is especially important when we're using what we call parameters here, is to make sure that those parameters are written and named in a way that makes sense to your end users, right? These are other people that are going to interact with your code. And like Angel alluded to earlier, they're not going to need to know the intricate details of the Azure resource that's being created, but they do need to know things like how are they going to name it, what resource group location are they going to put it in. So those types of parameters, you want to make them pretty well described, right? So that the end user understands what those parameters are and what they're going to be used for. So that's one of the things that makes template specs very usable. One and the best practice is to make sure that you name your parameters. Um, uh, they're well named and they don't include descriptions or other things that don't provide hints to the end user as to how they're used. Right. So that's kind of
Got
what
it.
we here. We've updated both the location and the Cosmos DB account name to give very good descriptions as to what we are expecting to be passed in as a parameter. Okay. So now that we created our bicep file that's going to create our template spec, we're going to go ahead and save it. One of the first things that we want to do is make sure we log into Azure. In this case, I already logged in, so I'm not going to repeat it, but you typically would do an AZ login. It would bring up a browser window. You would enter your credentials, and it would then log you into Azure. Um, as as a best practice, as you would do in working with Azure through the Azure CLI terminal, like I'm doing here right now in Bash, whether it's Bash or PowerShell, if you have multiple subscriptions or multiple Azure accounts, you want to make sure that after you log in, you do an AZ account set. And this is good practice whenever you're working with Bicep, right? You want to make sure that you understand which subscription and which accounts you're going to be running your Bicep code against. So the next thing I would do if I have multiple subscriptions, I would do an AZ account set followed by either my subscription name or my subscription ID. And I've already done that. And so you want to make sure you do that as well to make sure Bicep knows what the default subscription is going to be for that. The other thing that we can do is we can go ahead and even do this. Let's see if I have the command in my thing. I can do an AC configure and pass it a dash dash defaults along with the name, the parameter group equals, and that's gonna tell Bicep as well as the Azure CLI, what default group I'm going to be working against. So if I don't specify a default resource group inside the AZ command, it will default to this. So in this case, I don't have to repeat a resource group parameter to any AZ command. It would just go ahead and deploy everything to my template specs demo or resource group that I've created.
Got it.
Yeah. Perfect. So now, once we've done all that, we are ready to publish. So in this case, I've got a command up here called azts create, and let me go ahead and copy it.
So TS is the prefix for template specs in this case. So TS is the template specs
Yeah.
command group in the Azure CLI.
Yes. And so if you're looking here, I do an azts template spec create, and I pass it a name, dash dash name, right, with some parameter, and I'm going to call this toys Cosmos DB account. Location, it's West US 2. It should be the location that my resource group is created in. It doesn't have to be, but in my case, I want to make them uniform, so I do. I pass it in a display name, and that's going to be Cosmos DB account, followed by a description, right? This template spec creates a Cosmos DB account that meets our company's requirements, and then I pass in a version, dash dash version, which is 1.0. followed by a --template-file, which is the parameter that points to the path of my bicep file.
Got it. And one thing to note here, that version, it's not strictly numeric. So right now we're using 1.0, but we could have very well used some actual verbal language if it's to indicate something else. Maybe in the future 2.0 of this, there's an actual hotfix that we want everyone to deploy, and we want to denote that as well very explicitly. We'll talk more about versioning schemes and versioning guidelines, but right now it's one thing to keep in mind as the main benefits of a template spec is that you are not only creating this container in Azure, but this will have a history over time as your Azure environment matures, as your self-service templates end up maturing with your organization's needs as well.
Correct. Very good point, Angel. We could have, we started here with semantic versioning, but again, we could have really used any type of versioning that makes sense to our enterprise. So with that, if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and run it. So that's going to take a little bit of time here. So it didn't like my JSON here. Let's see, failed to please check whether it's valid JSON. Let's look and see if we missed anything here. I think we're good. Let's see why, and it's being finicky with me right now. Let's run it again one more time here. Okay. Let's see what can be happening here. I'm going to look at my JSON file, make sure there's nothing here that I may have missed. So let me check here. And let's give it a once over. So we have parameter, that's fine. Description, fine. It's not giving me anything wrong here. Unique, okay, good. Max DB, we've got that. We've got all our, and again, JSON is a little bit finicky here, so we want to make sure we've got this right. Goes back to here. That looks good. And we here. That looks good. We've got our location. Got our location properties. And we've got our backup policy. Okay, and then, yep, everything's aligning good here. Could be we have some weird characters here that maybe it doesn't like. Let me do that. Never know. Go ahead and save it. Okay, let's give it one more shot. And this, well, we're not spend too much time on this. We'll go ahead and look at what should be happening. So if this would have ran successfully, we would be able to come in here into our Azure portal. In the resource group, we would actually be seeing a template spec resource under here which will have our template spec. So maybe while we move on to the next set of slides, I'll get that working and see what's going on with the JSON file not properly compiling here. So with that, do you wanna get back to
the? As you kind of bring that back up, I'm just gonna run through what was gonna be kind of happening in the demo. So we're gonna create and publish this template spec. You saw a little bit about the main.bicep file that authors this Cosmos DB account, and that's the Cosmos DB account we want our app teams to use. So we are in the process of taking this main.bicep file and publishing, or I guess using the azts create command to create / publish the first version of our toy Cosmos DB account. So we're gonna take a look at how that gets created. But one of the things to break down in the template that you saw is that we're using parameters, and parameters is a key element to infrastructure as code in being able to ask whoever is deploying a given template to fill in a property value. So that might be something as simple as a name for the Cosmos DB account, or maybe even a particular SKU of database that is going to be created. So be very intentional with the parameters that you offer to, I guess, be parameters, because you don't want to parameterize everything and then have your app teams having to fill out the entire template anyways. It defeats the whole purpose. So you only want to parameterize very specific things that need to change every time this gets deployed, or maybe even needs to be unique. For example, storage account names are unique. And if a storage account is going to be created, then it's very likely that a particular team has to create a unique name for that. And that's a good example of something that you would traditionally parameterize. But you want to, again, make the template as easy to redeploy as possible. So minimizing the number of stuff any person deploying this template has to do, the better it is. So right now, another thing that we kind of briefly saw is how some of those parameters can also be enforcing some type of allowed values. Like maybe there's this list of SKUs that are the only allowed values. So whatever parameter value gets passed in by an app team that's trying to deploy this, if they say potato, for example, and that is not the actual name of a SKU value for a Linux VM, then it's probably not going to work. And you want to be able to block this deployment forever going through, so you can embed a couple of checks into the parameters themselves, and set restrictions such as length of a parameter value and stuff like that. But one key thing, again, is don't overdo it with the parameters. So this is kind of what it will look like to customers. They end up deploying this template spec or clicking on it and saying, I want to deploy this. When it goes on to actually be deployed, whatever was parameterized in that template is going to pop up in a UI similar to this one. And then whatever person on the app team is probably going to go, okay, this is going to be for a non-production environment type. I'm just doing a test with this Cosmos DB account. I'm going to run it to West US and give me, I don't know, 3 different SQL servers to run this test. So this is a good example of just a minimal amount of exactly what you need in a parameter list to still provide that frictionless self-service model to your app teams. Moving on. All right, so after you publish that template spec, you ended up authoring that first template, you publish it as a version 1. You might end up making some changes to it and publish it as version 2 again, and so on and so forth. Right now, the main thing to always keep in mind is a template spec's name has to be very descriptive as to what it's going to do. So we called that previous one the Toy Cosmos DB account. Toy being our company name, and then what does it do? It deploys a Cosmos DB account. Straightforward enough. This is super, super important because you don't want to the whole point is to avoid the teams coming back and asking you questions. That you want to make it as straightforward as possible, so keep the name in consideration. All right. Hopefully William's getting that demo set up back for us. This is more of the same stuff, so I'm just going to skip. So after you deploy the template spec, all right, let's see. We published it. It's already in this template spec resource in Azure. Now someone can actually click on that Toy Cosmos DB account and say, I want to deploy this to this resource group. That's whatever, my resource group. Or actually, first I'm going to deploy this other template spec that creates a resource group for me. And then this second template spec, I'm going to deploy it into that resource group. This makes the life cycle for deployment and authoring very easy for app teams because they can just focus on their thing. They don't have to know any of this cloud infrastructure stuff, which often ends up consuming a lot of time. And rightfully so. You want to get it right. But the app teams don't need to focus on that. They are probably more suited to spend the bulk of their time actually developing the app or actually working on whatever website needs to get done. Um, so now that we've created this self-service model, there's a bunch of time given back to the app teams as a result of that. And there's also a security aspect to it where, hey, now if I'm just creating something by this template spec, I can rest assured that this template spec is abiding by my company policies. So I can sleep tight on, this is configured properly and I can actually focus on my app work. So this essentially just shows the PowerShell commandlet that we would have been using to deploy this. We're actually doing CLI in the demo. So I guess this is just for those of you who are curious, this is what a resource group deployment via template spec ID would look like. A little bit more on the commandlets. Oh, cool. One thing to note again is you can deploy a template spec at any scope. So a template spec can be deployed at the resource group scope, subscription scope, management group scope, and even tenant scope. So there's a lot of range as to not just where an ARM template can be stored, but also where it can be deployed to in that self-serve fashion. And there's different scenarios that we can get into. And if folks have questions, definitely send those our way. But essentially, you end up wanting to group things together wherever a team's doing the bulk of their work. And in terms of where a template spec should live, if a particular team needs access to it or shouldn't have access to it, then you're going to make sure to create that at the given scope. Because since it's a resource like any other Azure resource, it has to abide by Azure RBAC rules. So with our Azure RBAC rules, you're able to control access to these template specs that you store across your Azure real estate, if you will. So that is another thing to note. William, how are we doing with the demo there? Just checking in.
Good question. So I got the command to work, and I can show what I did if you want to turn the screen back to me.
Awesome. Sure. It's a good time.
Okay. So again, and this could be, I'll be bluntly honest here. It could be because again, this command is still in preview. But what I ended up having to do, one of the things that the beauty about Bicep, right? Bicep is just another way to create ARM templates or Azure Resource Manager templates, which are an Azure Resource Manager template is simply just a JSON file that we use to describe and create resources in Azure. It's kind of our API language. And so what I noticed was that when we use the azts create command, you could pass in a bicep file or a JSON file. Can everybody see my screen where I'm highlighting right here?
Yep.
So under the template file, you can pass in either a bicep file or a JSON file. Typically, if you put in a bicep file, it should convert that to JSON and then use that JSON to deploy the template spec.
Got it.
When we got the error, I noticed it kept saying that it did not like the resulting JSON. So it led me to believe that maybe the command's not converting the bicep to JSON correctly, right? That was just my assumption. So what I did was I ran what's known as a bicep build main.bicep. Main.bicep was the bicep file I used to describe that template spec, and it created this JSON file, right? And I did that because I wanted to make sure my JSON was good. And so here's where it created, and I looked at it and said, this is exactly the JSON that I want. So what I did then was I actually passed the JSON file to the TS command, as you can see over here. I passed that here instead of the bicep file. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes sense, and this is
And so I
actually
skipped a
very,
step. I
very
actually did a
common.
step. Yeah, I did a step for it, right? Initially, you
Yeah,
shouldn't have to do that. But again, folks, we're still in preview, as you can tell here. And
yep.
so until some of those kinks get worked out, I'm sure that we'll provide proper feedback, right? So we'll go ahead and do that. And anyway, once I did that, it got the output that I wanted, which is it shows me everything it's creating. And so if I go back to my Azure portal, and I go in here, there is my template spec. So if I create in here, it's an actual resource. We can look here, and it is my template spec. Tells me the display
Got it.
name,
So
description, creation name.
can you click
And then,
on versions in the
yes,
left nav menu?
yes, we'll click on versions.
All
Yep,
right, so it
it's
looks like we
1.0.
just have one lonely version.
Because I only ran it once, right? If I ran it multiple times, I would have additional versions.
Let Totally. So right now we can just make a quick edit to that template and create a second version.
Yep, we can do that. Let me go and bring up Visual Studio Code. And let's see what we can do here. I'm looking at the wrong one. All right. So in my
There we go.
bicep file, maybe what I can do here, what could I do to change let's make zone redundant true. How's that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And, typically I would change that into code. I'm going to regenerate my JSON. So I'm going to go and close that window. So I'm going to do a bicep
Bicep build.
build and pass in my name of a bicep file.
For those of you who joined late, bicep build essentially takes whatever bicep file and turns it into an ARM template. It compiles down to ARM template JSON. So
So
there should
now,
be a main.json that got
yeah, so
created
if I
just
go ahead
now.
in here, I should be able to see a main.json file here.
There it is. Yep.
And let's see, there it is. And we open it up, and here it is, right? And it's got all the different changes I made. So now I'm going to go and deploy it. And when I deploy it, I'm going to call this version 1.1. How's that?
Yep. Sounds good to me.
Since we're keeping with semantic versioning, we'll go ahead and enter that.
So now if we go to the Azure portal, we'll be seeing two versions.
Yeah. I'm going to wait for the command to run. Once it runs and it outputs the resource that it's creating, like it did right now, I know that I'm ready to go to the portal and look. So I go to the portal, and if I do a refresh, there it is.
Awesome.
I've got two
And
versions of
from
that.
right here, anyone can go ahead and deploy 1.1 as is. I believe it's
Yes.
in the three dots. There
Yep.
we
I
go.
just go here. I go to deploy, and I run a custom deployment. And pretty much it allows you to specify the values for the parameters that you have described in your template spec, as well as the resource group. And voila, it will go ahead and create that for you.
Awesome. Awesome. Cool.
I'll turn it back to you, Angel.
Sounds great. All right. So we saw a little bit about, I guess, in versioning itself, we were managing the template spec. We were in that template spec resource, as you saw in the portal, and we were managing it by introducing a new version that made change of a simple property. We could continue to do this and publish many different versions. But what do we mean when we say versioning exactly? And something as simple as adding a new version. So it's up to the company to decide how they want to go about introducing new versions. Every time you introduce a new version, you have to get all your teams to adopt it very often. There might be some exception cases here and there. But when a new version gets created, it has to follow a certain versioning schema. And by versioning schema is whatever your team decides. So we could have decided something numeric at the very beginning and just say 1, 2, 3 and do integers all the way. We could also use dates. We could, every single time we publish a new version to a template spec, use that specific date of the day to denote that. We could also do semantic versioning, which is what we were doing, adopting numbers and the dot uh, syntax as well to just do 1.0, 1.1, etc. Whatever works for you is fine, but it has to be clear in terms of when I'm going to publish a new one, what the heck do I call this thing? What's the new version? And if you anticipate it's going to be more than just your central cloud team creating these templates, then that has to be thought through very well, because you don't want all of a sudden conflicting versioning schemas being thrown into the mix and then folks don't know what template they have to deploy. That's why also being kind of overly descriptive is very important. But one thing to note is that if you don't use the date versioning schema, don't worry about that. It doesn't mean the date information is lost. You're going to still have date information associated to each version within the template spec itself. Yeah, I think that's one of the call outs here. Cool. But William, what's, I guess, more complicated for us now that we're creating all these toy Cosmos DB account templates? Maybe we'll do a VM template later this afternoon. Whenever we want to publish a new version, we have to have a set policy in mind. And I guess this boils down to two key things. Are you going to publish a new version? Meaning, if we did 1.0 and 1.1, does that mean if we do a new iteration on this Cosmos DB template, will it be 1.2? Or will we overwrite 1.1, the latest one, or maybe even the first one, 1.0? That decision to create a new version versus overwrite an existing version is a versioning policy that your company has to decide. So what do you think we should go with?
So that's a good question, Angel. I think we should go with the versioning policy.
So right now, I guess for us, every time a change happens, it doesn't matter. So if something new is being introduced, like let's say, for example, a new resource got added to that template, we definitely want to bump that version up and publish a
Mhm.
new version. But maybe we're in a situation where there's a hot fix or some particular security flaw that was identified and needs to be updated in all the versions. There, it's perfectly fair game to go and overwrite those template spec versions that have that outdated or potentially insecure infrastructure configuration. And to make sure you keep things tidy, make sure to delete old versions once they're no longer relevant. You want to keep this self-service vending machine very accurate and up to date with what your company should be deploying or should be building on. So it's just as important to provide the new things as it is to delete the old things, because then the old things can accidentally be created, dependencies are taken, and then it's a whole process to work your way back to the new. So that's a little bit on versioning policies. Was there anything else top of mind there, William?
No, I would say that for anybody that's been in software development, it's exactly like you would do when you're developing consumable packages or reusable components as part of a larger software development project. You want to apply that same type of reasoning, right? So if it's a significant change, it's a new version. If it's a minor change like a hot fix, you just update the version number. When things get deprecated, you actually remove those or you deprecate those components. Exactly the same type of policy, and that's why my preference, and it could be just from my development background, is I like the semantic versioning. And for those of you who aren't, I know I mentioned that a couple of times. For those of you who aren't used to what semantic version is, in a nutshell, it's where a single version number contains multiple information, multiple parts, and each part has multiple information about what those changes were, right? So if you have like one number followed by a dot followed by another number, it would be major changes would be you change the first number, minor changes you change the second number. So that's typically something that works really good in software development and applies exactly to infrastructure as code, which is what we're doing here.
Awesome. Cool. I'm gonna quickly run through these last couple slides because we actually have
Sure.
some exercise for everyone, and we're hoping we get the highest score of attendees. I think this is the very last session of the Learn Live track, so let's make sure we get the best score here, William. Let's make them proud.
Sure.
So we talked about versioning schemas. We talked about versioning policies, versioning descriptions, pretty self-explanatory. Make sure to give a good description to your version, whether it's explaining the hotfix that's being introduced or explaining the new resource that's being introduced or removed for that matter. So as we segue into these exercises, we're going to cover a couple quick things here. Just want to reiterate, a template spec is a resource. You can do what you would with any other Azure resource with a template spec. So you can make use of other commandlets like the set commandlet to change the names, the properties of that resource itself. So it can go through that entire lifecycle management process that any of your other Azure cloud resources would go through. And one thing to also note is a bicep file, once it's compiled into an ARM template and stored into this template spec, you lose that bicep file. So, it's still in your local machine, but you don't have that same bicep syntax once it's turned into ARM template JSON. So if that's relevant information that you want for your app teams, you should probably have it stored somewhere such that they can easily access that as well. But again, the goal is to create that self-service vending machine. So the idea is for folks to be able to point to a template spec, have that deployed, and carry on with their day. And continue on building those apps or whatever it is they have to do. They shouldn't be getting a template spec and editing it or doing anything. There might be situations where they are, but for this particular scenario, the challenge again is sharing and the cloud architects being the bottleneck for what gets deployed. So if you want to address that bottleneck, keep these templates as modular as possible. So it's just deploy and move on. Cool. One other cool thing here is you can actually export a template spec like you would another Azure resource. So if you want to see the JSON for the template spec itself and how a template that got stored in the template spec gets embedded further into that JSON, you could export a template spec with this command here to actually see what that looks like. But that's pretty much it. So I'm actually, one quick thing. We already talked about this, but it's very important, so let's reiterate. Since a template spec is an Azure resource like any other, you can apply RBAC to it to limit who can actually see this resource, who can edit this resource, who can deploy this resource, and so on and so forth. So one key element that is being enabled by template spec is not just security by Azure Active Directory and consequently RBAC rules, but also sharing becomes a lot easier because these template specs can now live within your Azure environment as well.
Correct. And since if you limit the ability for people to author it, then you don't have to run and you don't have to worry about anybody going in there making changes to it, right? Your end users would pretty much just have read-only access, and all they can do is deploy it.
Correct. Cool. So we can, I don't know, William. So we did do the
We kind of
update
did
of the
that. We didn't do a
version in
yeah.
the
We didn't
demo.
do a major change, but we did a small change so that you got the idea of kind of how it works. We could go into
Do you want
a
to
more in
quickly
template.
show just deploying the template spec itself from the portal, just so folks can see
Yeah,
what
yeah,
that experience for the app teams
yeah.
would be?
That'd be perfect. So if you want to
And
turn it over to me. So as you can see here, you can also use the portal, but you can also use the typical PowerShell, Azure CLI command, which is AZ deployment group, right? We would use that to deploy any type of ARM template. You do that exactly the same way with a template spec. So in this case, it would be AZ deployment group create, and you would pass it in the template spec with the template spec version resource ID, which would be, if we go to the portal, would be where's my template spec? Here and here. The resource ID would be here. You could also extract it. Where would be my resource ID? Probably under properties.
yep.
Yep. It would be this, right? So I could literally pass this in, and let's see if it works. I can pass this in and create another. So in this case, I had it in an environment variable, but I could just pass it in as a string. Oops. See, come here and do this. And that should create another Cosmos database account in the same resource group that I create. I could have given a different resource group. Oh, didn't like it. Again, preview. But
I think you might
that's
have
simply
to have the
in quotes.
quotation marks. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought about that. But let's see. Let's go in here.
Yeah, give that a try. If not, I think it's fine just to see it in the
Yeah,
portal.
we'll do the portal. So let's give that a shot. Again, we're dealing with cutting edge right here. So let's make sure that that runs. It might that might just be it. Nope, didn't like it. So let's go
I
ahead
think
and
it's
just
the
go ahead and shut it.
quotes itself, not the double quotes. That's my bad. But
Oh,
let's
you think it's
actually
no?
see it here. This is where you
Yeah,
would typically, I
let's go
guess,
ahead and
want
do the
your app
deploy.
teams to go and deploy it from, because they can actually see the list and easily click on each template spec to see descriptions pop up, etc.
So
You
in this
could
case,
also get the list of template specs via CLI, and these options are still available to the developers that choose.
correct.
But for the purpose of today, let's kind of just walk through what this looks like in the portal.
Yeah. So when I go ahead and hit deploy in the portal, it asks me what resource group. I'm going to use the same resource group that I'm using for that. You could create a new one, and then the typical parameters that the template spec is asking you for: the region, the location, and the Cosmos DB account name. And it will go ahead and populate this with the defaults that you specify in your template spec. So I'm going to go ahead
Got it.
and go with my defaults. And let's see what happens here. Oops. And let's do a review and create.
And this is the 1.1, so the latest version.
Correct. And let's go ahead and create that. So it's going to go ahead and do the deployment. That could take 1 to 2 minutes. And at that point, we should be able to see a Cosmos DB account in our resource group.
There you go. We see the resource itself, toy,
Correct.
and some unique string got appended to that per
Mm-hmm.
the unique string function that we had in our bicep template.
Mm-hmm.
And then after this gets created, an app team can continue on and build on top of this resource, continue on without having to worry of, is this infrastructure properly configured? because we already took care of properly configuring it.
Oh, didn't like it. Let's see. Service unavailable. Data account failed.
This looks like it's something agnostic to.
Sorry, we are experiencing
Um,
currently high demand in West Region, US 2.
there we go.
Yeah, so it means, yeah, this is like not necessarily
Probably
anything
need
that
to
we did.
pick a different location.
Correct,
But in a
correct,
nutshell, this did a good job of visualizing the actual workflow of just you quickly identify a template spec in a list in the portal. You click to deploy that, fill out whatever parameters are still requested, and off you go.
correct.
Awesome. I think we can move on to the knowledge check questions if
Yes,
if you think that's all right.
let's go and do that.
Awesome. All right, so I'll switch it over to me in a sec. All right, let's test your knowledge and see how useful we were today, I guess, in a nutshell. Hopefully, a little bit useful. All right, so first question, and we're going to leave this up here for a while so folks can vote. You can vote at that QR code there or go to ak.ms/polls. So the first question is, in which of these situations should you use a template spec version? William, can you read the options off for
Yes,
viewers?
yeah, so we have first option, A, you need to publish an update to a template spec. B, you need to deploy a template spec to a different subscription. Or C, you need to deploy multiple copies of the template spec to different resource groups. So again, that's A, you need to publish an update to a template spec. B, you need to deploy a template spec to a different subscription. Or C, you need to deploy multiple copies of the template spec to different resource groups.
Remember what a template spec version is. So again, a template spec is that container resource that lives in Azure and stores your ARM template. And probably that first time you went and created that template spec, you created the first version. And then once that life cycle of the template spec grows and it moves on and matures over time, more versions are introduced in the form of newer ARM templates or bicep templates, if you will. Um, let's give it another 10, 20 seconds. You could probably surface the answer. Actually, let me check the polls real quick and see where we're at here. All right, we got a couple votes in. I see one correct answer already. It's good to see. Let's give it another 20 seconds, actually. All right. See the answer. A. So you'd need to publish an update to a template spec. You should probably create a new version once you publish that update. You can overwrite the existing version, but that's not the. It depends on your versioning policy again. All right, let's move on to the next question. You have created and published a template spec that includes a parameter. Which of the statements is true?
So the first one would be the parameter must have a default value. Or B, template specs can't have parameters. Or C, when a template spec is deployed, the user will need to provide values for the parameter if the default value isn't specified. So which one of those statements is true? The parameter must have a default value. Template specs can have parameters. Or when the template spec is deployed, the user will need to provide values for a parameter if the default value isn't specified. We kind of showed these three. Um,
Variations.
yeah, so it'd be interesting to see your answers.
All right, let me take a quick look at the polls. All right, you got some votes in. Let's probably wait another 10 seconds. All right, so let's take a look at the answer. C, when the template spec is deployed, the user will need to provide values for the parameter if a default isn't specified. So again, we saw in that bicep template that one can specify a default value for something like name, the name of the Cosmos DB account. We had the prefix toy and a unique string function to try and append something unique at the end of that, and that would serve as the default name value. But I could have gone ahead and edited that, or William could have gone ahead and edited that in the parameter box and introduce whatever other name. So if a default value isn't specified in the template, then some value is going to have to be provided in that parameter box. If not, it's not going to allow the deployment to continue.
Correct. And one thing important to mention is parameters don't have to have a default value.
Correct. Those aren't required. All right, last question. Which of these is a capability of template specs?
So A, template specs provide a place for you to store and share your templates throughout your organization. Or B, template specs control the lifetime of your Azure resources. Or C, template specs ensure that your templates will definitely deploy. So again, that's A, template specs provide a place for you to store and share your templates throughout your organization. Templates, or B, template specs control the lifetime of your Azure resources. Or C, template specs ensure that your templates will be definitely deployed.
Got it. And remember, we've been calling the template spec resource kind of a container resource this entire time. That should give it away. But
correct. And if you go back to our initial scenario, that would also help you as well. The reason why we're using template specs.
all right, let me see. So we got a couple votes already in this third question. Folks are getting them right, so we've been doing something right, William, this entire
Yes,
time. That's good to
that's good news.
see.
Yes, very good news.
All right, let's see. For question 3, actually, let me do another 10 seconds. Just make sure everyone gets some time in. Get the answer. All right, now we can take a look. So the answer is A. A template spec, it provides a place for you to store and share templates throughout your organization. So you're storing them in a resource called template spec in your Azure subscription and sharing them across that Azure subscription with whomever needs to access this self-service vending machine model for infrastructure code. So I'm an app team. William is also an app developer. We're in dire need of creating Cosmos DB accounts, virtual machines, app services, so we can start up an e-commerce business. We're gonna look towards our Cloud of Excellence team or Cloud Architect team to say, hey, what templates should we be using to go and create these so we can then move on to building the app itself. And by using template specs, we're going to have a very easy experience of just quickly identifying which template specs we need. So it looks like we need these 2 Cosmos DB account template specs, this other VM template spec. We deploy those and then we can move on to actually build our e-commerce app very frictionlessly. With that being said, uh, what we just covered today, again in summary, is we created a template spec. So we stored an ARM template, a bicep template into a template spec, and then we were able to deploy that template spec from the Azure portal. We're able to then update that template spec. So we changed one of the properties and ended up publishing a new version to that same template spec. So we went from a 1.0 version to a 1.1 version, which we later then also deployed in the Azure portal. So I think with that, we're pretty much nearing an end here. Was there anything top of mind, William, that you think we might have missed so far with regards to template specs?
No, the only thing I'd like to point out again, the TS create command is still in preview, right? So we want to make sure that we gather your feedback. So if anybody goes ahead and goes through these exercises or starts using it, we welcome all your feedback. We'll definitely want to make it a good user experience, and Angel and I will be following up with the product group and sharing kind of some of the things we discovered with the command so far. But I do encourage you to test it out and let us know what you think.
Yeah, so that's for that specific command set, but one thing to note is that template specs is GA. It has been GA for a
Yes.
while now, so don't be afraid to take any dependencies on it. And if there's any more complex, long-winded questions that probably can be answered in the time we have here, feel free to reach out. You could reach out to our Twitter handles and we can point you in the right direction and make sure we're taking into consideration your scenarios with the next investments we're doing for template specs.
Yes. Yeah, everything we were doing here, and again, what's in preview is the ability to do this with Bicep. But like Angel said, template specs are GA and they're all available. You can do all this in the portal as well, manually.
Cool. And to learn more about deployment scripts, which is another cool resource, we have another Learn Live session here. I think this is meant to be a reference to our existing session. It looks like there was a confusion here. But anyways, we're at it. So for those of you who don't know what deployment scripts are, it's a very cool Azure resource that lets you kind of do the last mile of things you can't do within a template language. And something like, for example, running a particular bash script or running a particular PowerShell script, you can do that within a deployment script resource within an ARM template today. So I'll let you folks look more into that. But lots of good stuff being invested in the Azure deployment space, and template spec is one key piece that's going to help enable this self-serving vending machine scenario for a lot of our customers. So if there's
Yeah,
any questions, let's dive right in. Go ahead, William.
yeah, I'd like to add also, we have a whole Bicep series here. So this is the, like we alluded to earlier, this is the final session in our series that we had on learning Bicep and all of the various things you can do with the Bicep language. By all means, you can head there to the link that you're seeing right here, and you'll see, you'll get access to all the exercises as well, all the recordings of the sessions that we did in this series.
Cool. All right. And our last slide here. You can rewatch this whole series. I've heard this Learn Live series has been amazing. It's been about 15 episodes, and we're lucky enough to be one of the very last ones. So it's been great sharing today with y'all. If any questions in the chat that we might want to take, we can use a few minutes for that. If not, let me just double check real quick. All right, there's a bunch of questions here. Let's see.
Oh, it looks like our moderator was able to answer all the questions.
Nice. Good
Thank you,
stuff.
Will. Thank you, Will. I do want to give a shout out to Will for handling all the questions on the back end. Thank you, Will.
Awesome. All right, then I guess we're at the closeout. Thanks a lot, folks. Appreciate the time.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
good one.
Bye bye.
See ya.